If you would be so kind as to go into your working folder and open up bonnie@golf.psd. This is our first image. So far in this lesson series, we have dealt with theory, the game of theory, especially in this chapter. We've set up our color settings. We've done spider calibration. We've made sure our workspace is exactly the way it's supposed to be. Incidentally, although I've mentioned this before, let me mention this again. If you go up to the word Photoshop on a Mac or Edit in Windows and go to Preferences, don't forget in the Interface Preferences, you can change literally the background that you're working with. Now I'm going to set that back on default, click OK. What does that do? Well, the background is really a distraction to the image. And so you can set it up in a way that you feel that you're focusing on the image and not the interface. And a lot of little things you can do. We're here on this image. Now you might say, well, Andy, I took some earlier courses on Photoshop from you at Infinite Skills, and you did use the same image. And why aren't we using maybe something different? Well, there's a reason. There's a method to my madness, at least for this one image. Photoshop has changed the game when it comes to the interpretation of color from earlier versions. And although, if you remember me using this image, the settings I will use in this particular lesson, in this chapter for this Photoshop, are different from earlier versions. Now, that's not really too frustrating. Don't worry about that. Because what we're dealing with here is dealing with an image and working with physical color the way we see it, because we've calibrated. So we're not going by the numbers. The numbers haven't changed. If you do color correction by math, that's the same. But if you're doing it, and I do it this way a lot, if I'm using my eyes to decide what I like, well, it's actually changed just a little bit. Now, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to balance out the color. Color is a game of opposites. For example, if an image has too much blue in it, you remove blue, you're adding yellow. You have to add something. Color doesn't exist in a vacuum. Everything's about opposites when you're dealing with an image and you're trying to correct the color. What we're going to use is an adjustment layer. Now, this is probably one of the first times we've really got into adjustment layers. You can go up to the word image on the pull-down menu and go down to adjustments and use adjustments here. But when you do, you're doing destructive editing. In other words, you're actually physically changing the image. Since adjustment layers have come out, that's about all I ever use because they really work and they give you control, and that's why we're here. Now, I've split the image into two, got it in two pieces, so we can kind of see a before and an after. And I've selected right down here, the right side. If I come down to this button, this half moon icon right here, I can choose one of my adjustments for an adjustment layer. But there is another way to do this. I can go up to the adjustments panel. Incidentally, we are in the Essentials workspace, so we're kind of all on the same page here. This icon right here, it looks like a set of scales. That's color balance. So go ahead and click that. Over here, you have tone. Now notice it's midtones, shadows, and highlights. Think of it this way. When I was going to school, and they still do this, I'm sure, grade on a curve. And it's a bell curve where almost everything is in the middle, and then they taper off as you get to the really high grades and the really low grades. Midtones is where most of our stuff is. Shadows and highlights is where it's kind of tapering off on the bell curve in most images. So I do like to start with midtones. Sometimes I don't even bother with shadows and highlights if I like what I see. And remember, we are doing this with a calibrated monitor with our eyes. We're not using math. Now, I look at this image and I say to myself, it's got too much blue in it, and it probably has too much magenta. So I need more yellow to remove the blue, and I need more green. At least that's my thoughts right now. So I'm going to come in here, and I can move that slider back and forth if I want to, but I like a little bit more control. So here's a trick. Get into this box right here. You don't have to select the number 1. Just click in that box and use your up and down arrow keys. So if I need less blue, I need, in a sense, more yellow. Color doesn't exist in a vacuum. And if I use the up and down arrow keys, as you can see, I can make that number go up or down. And so I'm going to take it to the left by using the down arrow key, and I'm going to stop when I kind of like what I see. Well, I'll leave it there for now. And here's, so far, our before and after. It needs more green, so I'm going to click in this box. You could actually use your tab key, too, to get up there if you want to. And I'm going to add, so I'm going to use the up arrow key. I'm going to add more green to this. I think I'm going to add as much green as I took out the yellow. Okay, something like that. Let's go into highlights, and let's take out a little bit more of that blue in the highlight areas. And not a lot, though, just a couple. Something like that. And maybe just add in the highlights just a little bit more green. Something like that, actually. Now, what we have on the right is what we think is corrected, and on the left we can still see the original. If you want the image to be finished, let's go ahead and collapse this out by clicking here. Remember how adjustments work. What they do is they correct down. The reason this one hasn't been changed is because it's above this one. So by simply picking up here and grabbing and putting it on top, we then correct both sides. Now, typically you wouldn't put half of an image in each layer. We're just doing that so you can see the difference. And we can now turn that on and off and see the before and the color corrected after. Again, color correction here is relative. It's based on my monitor. It's based on my eyes. It's based on how I'm working. But yes, I do a lot of color correction with my eyes because I do have a calibrated system, and we've already talked about that. So here's a way to color balance, remembering the rule of opposites on your colors, using the color balance adjustment, totally non-destructive.